Hello, my name is William, and welcome to Dragon X Dominion, a realm where dragon legends are forged in fire, honor, and forgotten worlds. I will be your narrator and guide through these epic lands. If you crave powerful stories, legendary dragons, and wars that echo through eternity, then you found your home, ladies and gentlemen. So subscribe, and claim your place among these legends. The moon smelled wrong. That was the first thing Sora noticed when the shuttle doors opened, and the recycled air of Station Aldrich hit her face. It smelled like metal and something sweet and burnt, like humans had been living there long enough to change the air itself. She stepped down the ramp behind Elder Vorath and kept her wings folded tight against her back the way she had been told. Behave. Observe. Do not speak unless addressed. She had heard those three instructions so many times on the journey over that they had stopped sounding like words. Vorath moved slowly, the way very old Drakari always moved. Not because they were weak, but because they had decided that hurrying was something other creatures did. His scales were deep gray with age, and the two short horns above his brow had gone almost white. He was the oldest living member of the council. He had seen 6 human wars from a distance and had formed one opinion from all of them. Humans burned fast and loud and left a great deal of mess behind them. The station's human delegation was waiting at the end of the docking corridor. 2 wore dark fleet uniforms. One was a small woman holding a datapad. The fourth was a man with tired eyes and a calm face who introduced himself as Admiral Doss. Vorath acknowledged him with a tilt of his head, not a bow. Drakari did not bow. Sora stood 2 steps behind and studied everything. She had never been this close to a human settlement before. She had seen them from altitude, survey ships, cargo convoys, outpost lights floating in the dark. But this was inside. And inside, humans were everywhere, walking past in groups, carrying things, talking to each other. One small human near a side corridor was sitting cross-legged on the floor, pressing its face against a porthole window. A child, very small, dark hair. It glanced at the delegation and stared at Sora with no expression, then turned back to the window. Sora stared at the spot long after it was gone. The meeting room was large by station standards, which meant it was still smaller than any room Sora had ever been in. Humans built everything just big enough and no bigger. The table was rectangular. The chairs were designed for human bodies, which meant the Drakari delegation stood. Vorath had already informed them this would be the case, and had already informed the human delegation that offering chairs to Drakari would not be necessary. The talks began. Sora listened with half her attention because listening was required, and spent the other half looking out the narrow viewport at Vareth IV hanging in the dark below the moon. It was enormous from here. Bands of brown and amber, and a storm system near the equator that had been turning for 300 years without stopping. The Drakari had watched that storm from orbit before humans had learned to make fire. That was not something she would say out loud, because Vorath had also told her that historical accuracy was not always the same thing as helpfulness. The talks went the way most Drakari human talks went, from what she had studied. Each side restated its position. Each side acknowledged the other had restated its position. Neither side moved. She was beginning to understand why Vorath found humans exhausting. Then the station shook. Not a weapon impact, not a breach. Something internal, a low mechanical shudder that ran through the floor and the walls, and then died. The lights flickered. A flat automated voice said something in station standard about a system's fault in the residential corridor, and asked non-essential personnel to remain where they were. The Admiral looked at his wrist screen and said something quietly to one of his officers. Vorath's expression did not change. The diplomat looked nervous. Nobody seemed particularly alarmed. Sora looked at the door. She thought about the small human she had seen sitting by the porthole. The child. It had been in that side corridor near the residential section, and the residential section was the corridor the automated voice had just mentioned. She told herself this was not her concern. She told herself this for about 4 minutes while the adults in the room exchanged information about the nature of the fault and the estimated repair time. Then, very quietly, she took one step back from the delegation. Then another. Then she was in the hallway. She told herself she was only going to look. The sewer corridor was empty when she reached it. The porthole window was still there, still showing the same stars. The floor near it had a small smudge from where two small hands had been pressed against the wall for balance. Sora followed the smudge. The corridor branched, then branched again. The lights here were dimmer. The fault had rerouted power. She moved through 3 intersections, reading the small human directional signs she had studied on the journey over, and then she heard something. Breathing. Small, even, undisturbed breathing coming from behind a sealed auxiliary door to her left. She pressed the manual release. The door opened. Inside was a single low-lit storage room with 2 crates and a folded maintenance tarp and one small human child sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, looking up at her with eyes that were very large and very dark and not even slightly afraid. "Are you lost too?" he said. Sora opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Then she stepped inside. The door sealed behind her. She told herself she would only stay a moment. No body in the galaxy fell asleep faster than this child. That was Sora's first clear thought after sitting down on the cold storage room floor and watching Nail close his eyes. No crying, no asking for his mother, no fear. He simply pulled his knees up to his chest, rested his cheek against the wall, and went to sleep like he had done it 100 times in places exactly like this. Sora sat very still and stared at him. She had been in the room for perhaps 12 minutes. In that time, she had learned his name was Nail, that he was 6 years old, that he had followed a blinking light down the corridor because he thought it was a kind of insect he had read about, and that he was not worried because the station always makes those noises. It is probably fine. Then he had gone to sleep. Sora looked at the sealed door. She could open it. The manual release worked from the inside. She could walk back to the meeting room and tell an adult where the child was, and that would be the end of it. Simple. Correct. The kind of thing a well-behaved hatchling who followed instructions would do. She put her hand on the release bar. Then she looked at Nail again. The room was quiet except for his breathing and the low hum of the station's systems running somewhere behind the walls. The lights were on emergency low, just enough to see shapes. It was not cold exactly, but it was not warm either, and Nail was wearing a short-sleeved shirt and thin trousers. He did not have a jacket. He had not mentioned being cold. He had just curled up smaller and gone to sleep. Sora took her hand off the release bar. She told herself it was practical. She could not leave a small creature alone in a sealed room when the station was experiencing a systems fault. Something could go wrong. A pressure issue, a temperature drop. She was simply being logical. She sat back down. She was being logical. The temperature did drop about an hour later, not dangerously. But the boy made a small sound in his sleep and curled tighter, and Sora shifted without thinking and moved herself closer until her side was within reach of his back. The heat that Drakari carried in their scales was not fire. It was just warmth, steady and deep the way a sun-warmed rock holds heat long after the sun has moved. Nail uncurled slightly within a few minutes. He did not wake up. Sora sat with her side pressed gently against a sleeping 6-year-old and stared at the far wall. She began to speak. Quietly, under her breath, in the Drakari practice her grandfather called speaking memory. It was what Drakari did when they needed to make sense of something. They spoke it out loud to no one, let the words exist in the air, and listen to how they sounded. "He asked me if I was lost," she said. "He was the one locked in a room in the dark." She paused. "He was not afraid of me. I do not know what to do with that. Drakari young are afraid of unfamiliar elders. Human young are apparently afraid of nothing." She paused again. "He is very small." Outside the room, the station was not quiet at all. Dr. Riven had realized Nail was missing within 20 minutes of the lockdown. She had gone from worried to frantic in roughly the time it took the station AI caretaker Aura to confirm that yes, his biometrics were reading calm and alive somewhere in the residential section, but no. The precise location could not be confirmed because the fault had taken 3 sensor clusters offline. Aura said it in the same flat informational tone it said everything. Dr. Riven did not find this comforting. She was in the corridor with 2 station crew members, working through a manual grid search, when Admiral Doss found her and quietly told her that one of the Drakari had also gone missing from the meeting room. She stopped walking and looked at him. "The young one," he said. She stared at him for another moment. Then she started walking faster. In the meeting room, Elder Vorath had not moved from his position at the table. He had not asked where Sora was. He had not sent anyone to look. He sat with the stillness of a creature that had outlived most things it had ever worried about and waited. But the aide who stood closest to him, a young Drakari named Ferath, who had traveled with the council for years, noticed that Vorath's tail, which normally lay flat and still, had been moving in a slow, tight circle for the past hour. Vorath noticed Ferath noticing. The tail stopped. In the storage room, Sora was still awake when the station's night cycle dimmed the corridor lights to their lowest setting and the hum of the systems shifted to its quieter overnight tone. Nail slept on. His breathing was even and soft. He had not woken once. She watched the shadows on the far wall and thought about what Vorath always said, that humans were creatures of noise and impulse, burning bright and brief, not worth the patience they required. She had never had a reason to disagree. She looked at the sleeping boy. She thought, this one is very quiet. And then she kept watch, because no one else was there to do it, and the dark outside the porthole was full of stars, and something in her chest that she did not have a clean name for would not let her leave. Nail woke up like he had simply been waiting for a good reason to. One moment he was asleep. The next he was sitting up straight, looking around the room with clear eyes, and then looking directly at Sora as if he was not even slightly surprised to find a copper-green Drakari hatchling sitting 3 feet away from him in a dim storage room. "You stayed," he said. "The door is sealed," Sora said. Nail looked at the door, then back at her. "The release bar is right there." Sora said nothing. Nail nodded slowly, like this answer made sense to him, and then he said, "I'm hungry," which Sora could do nothing about, and he accepted this information with the same calm he seemed to apply to everything, and then asked if she wanted to talk. She did not want to talk. She wanted to be back in the meeting room doing what she had been brought here to do. She wanted to have made a different decision at the release bar last night. She wanted Nail to be less relaxed about all of this. "What do you want to talk about?" she said. What followed was, by Sora's later estimation, the strangest conversation she had ever been part of. Nail asked questions in no order at all, moving from one subject to the next the way a small animal moves through a field, not random exactly, but following something only it could sense. He asked if she could breathe fire. She said that was an ability some very old Drakari had, and she was not very old. He asked how old she was. She told him in Drakari years. He looked confused, so she gave the human equivalent, and he said, "Oh, so you're like a teenager," which felt a little undignified. He asked what Drakari ate. She told him. He made a face, but said nothing rude. He asked if dragons dreamed. She thought about this seriously before answering, which she could tell he appreciated. She told him that Drakari did not dream the way humans described dreaming, images, and stories while asleep, but that there was a state between waking and sleeping where old memories sometimes moved through the mind on their own. He said that sounded like dreaming to him. She said maybe it was. Then he asked if she had a best friend. She opened her mouth. She closed it. "It's okay if you don't," he said. "I didn't have one until I was 5. Before that, I just had a toy that I talked to." "I have kin," she said. "Drakari do not have best friends in the way you mean. That sounds lonely." "It is not lonely. It is different." Nail considered this. "Okay," he said. "Then, is the big one your grandpa?" Sora assumed he meant Vorith. "Yes. Does he like humans?" The honest answer was no. The diplomatic answer was complicated. Sora found she did not want to give either one to a 6-year-old looking at her with a genuinely curious expression. "He finds us difficult to understand," she said. Nail thought about this for a long moment with the focused seriousness he brought to everything. Then he said, "My mom says people get exhausted by things they don't understand yet." Sora sat very still. She turned that sentence over, examined it, set it next to what she knew of Vorath, the way his dismissal of humans never sounded like anger, only like weariness, like something that had been going on too long. She did not say anything. But the sentence stayed with her. The day passed slowly. Caretaker Aura's voice came through the room's small speaker twice to confirm that repairs were ongoing and that both missing individuals were confirmed safe. It did not explain why they had not been retrieved. The implication was that it was technically safer to wait. Sora suspected there was also a political reason nobody was saying out loud. Outside, Dr. Riven had stopped moving and started thinking. She had Nail's biometrics on her own screen now. A secondary feed, Caretaker Aura had routed to her directly. His heart rate was normal. His temperature was normal. He had been calm through the entire night. She did not understand why. Then Aura showed her the thermal overlay. One large heat signature, one small one. The small one nested against the large one through most of the night. She sat with that image for a long time. Admiral Doss came to find her in the evening. He had been in difficult conversations with the Drakari delegation all day. The talks were stalled. 2 of the human officers wanted to file a formal objection about the hatchling's unauthorized movement through the station. Doss had told them to hold it. "The Elder hasn't asked about her," Doss said. Not formally. "But his aide hasn't left the corridor near the sealed section since this morning." Riven looked at him. "He's waiting," she said. "Yes," said Doss. She looked back at her screen. The thermal image. One large shape and one small one. Steady through the dark. In the storage room, Nail had fallen asleep again with his back against Sora's side and his head dropped forward on his chest. He had talked until his eyes started closing mid-sentence. Sora had not told him to sleep. He had simply run out of words and gone quiet and then gone still. She stayed where she was. She thought about what he had said, about understanding, about exhaustion. She looked at the top of his dark head and thought, "He is 6 years old, and he is teaching me something, and I am not sure he even knows he is doing it. Repairs would be complete by morning." Caretaker Aura said so through the speaker in its flat, informational tone, and for once Sora wished it had stayed quiet. She did not examine why. Nail had been awake for most of the afternoon. He had used a corner of the maintenance tarp as a blanket and sat wrapped in it like a small, serious elder while Sora told him things about the Drakari homeworld. She had not planned to tell him anything. He had simply asked and then asked follow-up questions, and she had kept answering because his questions were genuinely good ones. Not the kind humans usually asked, which were mostly about fire and size, and how many things a Drakari could destroy. He asked about the storms, about what the ocean looked like from above, about whether Drakari had music. She told him about wind singing, the old practice of flying into high winds and letting the air move through the ridge plates along the spine and shoulders. Different shapes made different sounds. Young Drakari practiced for years to get the pitches right. Big groups of them flying together in formation could create something that carried for hundreds of miles. Nail was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said, "I want to hear that." "You would have to be very high up," she said. "That's okay," he said, like altitude was not a concern. She almost smiled. She was not sure if Drakari smiling looked like anything a human would recognize. Late in the afternoon, he asked the question she had known was coming, the way you always know when something you have been waiting for is finally arriving. "Will we see each other after?" he said. Sora looked at the door. "The diplomatic situation is complicated." Nail pulled the tarp tighter around his shoulders. That's what adults say when they mean no, but don't want to be sad about it. She did not have an answer for that. She did not try to find one. They sat in quiet for a while. the kind of quiet that was not empty. Nail seemed comfortable with silence in a way she had not expected from a human child. She had been told they needed constant stimulation. He seemed to need only occasional stimulation with long stretches of thinking in between. She found she respected that. When the station shifted into night cycle and the lights outside the door dimmed to their lowest setting, Nail said he was going to sleep and then lay down on his side on the floor with the tarp pulled up and closed his eyes. She watched him. He did not ask her to stay. He did not check to see if she was still there. He just trusted she was. That was the thing she could not explain. Not the trust itself. She understood trust as a concept, a calculated thing, something extended after sufficient evidence. What she could not explain was that he had never calculated it at all. He had walked into a room, found a Drakari hatchling, and simply decided she was fine. From that moment, as far as she could tell, the question of whether she was safe had never crossed his mind again. She had kept watch for 3 nights for a child who never once needed reassurance that she was there. She thought about that for a long time while he slept. Outside, the station was moving toward a kind of exhausted peace. Admiral Doss had spent the evening with caretaker Aura reviewing the full log of the past 2 days. Temperature maps, biometric feeds, Sora's movements through the room, the way she had repositioned herself in the first night when the temperature dropped, the consistent guard posture she had held through every sleep cycle, the fact that her own rest intervals had been almost non-existent. Doss had been in the fleet for 31 years. He had read a great many reports. He read this one twice. Then he made a call to his political liaison and said, "We're changing our opening position for tomorrow. I'll explain in the morning," and he ended the call before she could argue. Down a different corridor, Vorath was sitting alone in the small quarters the station had assigned to him. He was not sleeping. Very old Drakari needed less sleep than young ones. He was sitting in the dark with his eyes open and his tail flat and still, and he was thinking. Farath knocked and entered and asked if he needed anything. Vorath said no. Then, after Farath had turned to leave, Vorath said, "She did not leave the child." Farath stopped. She had multiple opportunities. The release bar was functional. No one would have known. A pause. She did not leave. Farath waited because he knew when Vorath was working towards something. "I have spent a great deal of time," Vorath said slowly, "deciding what humans are. I have watched them for a very long time." He paused again. "I wonder if I watched the wrong ones." Farath said nothing. Vorath said nothing further. The conversation was over. In the storage room, the last night of waiting was almost done. Nail slept peacefully against Sora's side with his cheek resting on his folded hands. His breathing was soft and slow. Sora watched the dark. She could hear the station waking up around her, the gradual increase in sound that came before a day cycle began. The hum of systems returning to full power, the distant sounds of movement in corridors. Morning was coming. She did not move. The repair team cleared the section at the 7th hour of the morning cycle. Caretaker Aura announced it the same way it announced everything, without ceremony, without any particular warmth. Pressure seals restored. Auxiliary corridor systems nominal. Access restored to all residential sections. Personnel were advised to resume normal movement patterns. The door to the storage room clicked and released. Nail woke up at the sound. He sat up, looked at the door, then looked at Sora. "I guess that's it," he said. "Yes," said Sora. He stood up and folded the maintenance tarp neatly and put it back on the crate where it had been. Sora noticed this. He did not have to do it. No one had asked him to. He simply left the room the way he had found it because that was the kind of person he was at 6 years old. They stood near the open door together for a moment. Neither of them moved through it. Then Nail reached into his trouser pocket and held something out to her. A small stone. Dark gray, smooth, with a faint mineral shimmer that caught the light when she turned it to look at it. "It's from Earth," he said. "From a river near where I was born. I carry it because it makes me feel less far from home." Sora looked at it. "I cannot accept gifts under Drakari protocol," she said. Nail nodded, like he had expected this answer. He kept his hand out. Sora looked at the stone for another moment. Then she picked it up and closed it carefully in her palm. They did not say anything after that, because there was not a clean way to end it, and both of them somehow knew that, and so they simply walked out into the corridor, and that was that. Dr. Riven arrived at a near run from the far end of the corridor. She was still in the clothes she had been wearing for 2 days. She dropped to her knees in front of Nael and pulled him against her and held on for a long time without speaking. Nael hugged her back and patted her shoulder in a small, patient way that suggested he had been comforting his mother since he was old enough to reach her. When she finally pulled back and looked at his face, checking, the way all parents do, that everything was truly fine, she saw that it was. Then she looked up at Sora. Sora stood still. She did not know what to expect. She knew some of what she should have done differently. She had left the delegation. She had entered an off-limits section. She had spent 3 days in an unauthorized location. There were a number of things Dr. Riven could have said. Dr. Riven said, "Thank you." In Drakari protocol, thanks from a human carried no formal weight. It was a social phrase, quickly given and quickly forgotten. Sora knew this. She nodded anyway. Elder Varath arrived 2 minutes later, walking at his usual pace. He looked at Sora with the expression she had spent her whole life learning to read. The one that gave nothing away. The one that meant he was thinking something important and had decided not to say it yet. He did not speak in front of the humans. He simply stood and looked at her, and she stood and looked back at him, and something passed between them that did not require words. His tale was still. The resumed diplomatic session that afternoon was different. Nobody who had been in the room for the previous days could have said exactly why. The same people sat in the same positions. The same issues were on the table. But there was a quality to the air that had changed. Varath agreed to 2 terms that the Drakari had previously declined to consider. They were not large terms. They were the kind of small, specific things that meant very little on their own and a great deal in combination because they showed a direction. Admiral Doss accepted one concession from the human side that his fleet advisors had called non-negotiable for 3 years. He did it without extended debate. The session ended 2 hours early because both sides had, without planning to, run out of objections. Afterward, in the corridor, Doss found Dr. Riven and said simply, "I read the thermal log." He paused. 3 nights she never slept. Riven looked at him. "No," she said. He nodded slowly and walked away. Riven looked back down the corridor toward the spot where Nail had been standing when she found him. Small and calm, like nothing had happened, like the world was a place that simply took care of you if you let it. She thought about what the thermal overlay had shown. One large heat signature, one small one. The small one nested warm and safe through 3 nights of dark. She thought about a creature that had no obligation to stay, that could have left at any moment, that by every rule and protocol should have left, and had looked at a sleeping child and decided that rules were less important than the fact that it was cold and dark, and someone small was alone. She stood in the empty corridor for a long time after everyone else had moved on. Then she went to find her son. 7 years passed. They passed the way years do when you are young and moving fast through a world that has more to teach you than you have hours to learn. In a blur of noise and growth and change, with a few moments that stay sharp and clear no matter how much time goes over them. For Nail, one of those moments was always a dark storage room and a copper-green shape sitting in the corner with steady, patient eyes. He was 13 now. He lived on Station Aldrich still because his mother's work had extended and then extended again and then simply become their life. He had grown up on that station, which meant he had grown up with stars on 3 sides of him and the gas giant Vareth IV filling the 4th, and he had never found this strange. He was studying xenobiology, following his mother's path. He was, by every account, very good at it. His professors noted that he had an unusual quality when it came to working with non-human subjects, a kind of unhurried, unafraid presence that put things at ease. He had never examined where it came from. He still carried the stone in his pocket. A different one. Now, the original had worn smooth over years of handling, and he had lost it for a week once and panicked in a way that was probably disproportionate for a rock. He had found it again in the lining of an old jacket. He still had it. He also kept it with a second stone now, dark green, unfamiliar, not from Earth. He kept them together. He did not explain this to anyone. For Sora, the 7 years had moved differently. She was no longer a hatchling by any measure. She had grown into her full first stage adult form, larger. Her scales deepened from copper green to something closer to bronze. Her wingspan enough that she had to think about doorways on human stations now. She was sharp and careful and known in Drakari diplomatic circles as someone worth watching. Not because she was celebrated, because she was effective. She had become a formal liaison between the Drakari Council and human diplomatic and scientific bodies. She worked in the space between the two species, the uncomfortable space, the space where misunderstandings turned into incidents, and incidents turned into the kind of problems that took decades to undo. She was good at it because she understood something that most Drakari liaisons did not, that humans were not simple. They were not loud and brief and obvious. They were, very often, just afraid of things they did not understand yet. She had carried that thought for 7 years. Vorath had never directly told her why she had been assigned to the role. He was not the kind of elder who explained his decisions. But when she had received the placement, she had gone to him and stood quietly in his presence, the way young Drakari did when they needed to say something, but did not have the words. He had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You stayed." 2 words, nothing else. She had understood that was enough. She still carried the stone in the inner compartment of her formal harness. Other Drakari had noticed. Nobody asked about it directly. A few younger ones, curious, had found indirect ways to ask. She had given them indirect answers. The stone was a navigational tool. The stone was a study sample. The stone had certain interesting mineral properties. None of these were true. The stone was from a river near where a boy had been born, and he had given it to her in a dim storage room because he wanted her to feel less far from home, and she had told him she could not accept gifts under protocol, and then accepted it anyway. That was the whole story. She did not need to explain it. It fit in the palm of her hand, and it reminded her of the thing she had learned in 3 nights of sitting in the dark with a child who trusted her without reason. That trust had not been payment for anything. It had not been strategic. He had not trusted her because she had done something to earn it. He had trusted her first, before she had done anything at all, and then she had spent 3 nights proving he was right too, and in doing so had become the kind of creature who could be trusted with bigger things. That was the part she thought about most. That was the part she had built her work on. Somewhere across the galaxies, in a classroom on Station Aldrich, Nail was writing a short paper about empathy behaviors in non-human species. He was writing about a documented case from 7 years prior, anonymized in the academic sense but perfectly clear to anyone who had been there. A non-human individual. A human child. 3 nights of voluntary protection with no strategic benefit and no instruction to do so. His professor would later ask him where the core observation had come from. Personal experience, he would say. And he would put his hand in his pocket without thinking about it, feeling the familiar weight of 2 smooth stones, and he would think about copper green scales in the dark and a voice speaking quietly to no one about the things it did not understand yet, and the long warm nights of Verithiform's moon, where something ancient and proud had looked at something small and trusting and chosen, without being asked, to stay.